The boy was dying in the snow. He was 7 years old, the only son of the Alpha King, and he had been missing for 11 hours when she found him. The search parties had gone east. The trackers had gone north. The royal guards had swept the Coal Peak Ridge 3 times and found nothing. She had gone into the Ashwood alone and found him in 4 minutes. 3 rogue wolves had him surrounded. Massive animals, battle-scarred, the kind that had survived long enough in the wild to lose every scruple. They were not hunting for food. They had been sent. She could smell the directive on them, the scent of another alpha embedded in their instructions like ink in skin. She had no weapon. She had no armor. She was wearing the plain gray clothing of a palace servant, which was what she had been pretending to be for 8 months. She stepped between the boy and the wolves. The largest rogue lunged. What happened next took 11 seconds and left 3 rogue wolves dead in the snow and a 7-year-old boy staring at a woman he had seen carrying laundry baskets through the palace halls, now standing in the red-stained snow with her eyes the color of burning gold and a stillness around her that had nothing to do with any servant he had ever seen. He looked up at her and asked one question. He said, "What are you?" She looked down at him. She had been hiding the answer to that question for 4 years. She was done hiding. Subscribe now and turn on the bell. Stories like this come every time. Like this video and leave a comment. Tell us what you think she is. Share this with someone who loves a powerful Omega story. Chapter 1. The Servant Who Did Not Bow Enough. The Palace of Keldrath had 400 rooms, 11 towers, and a staff of 312 servants who moved through it with the specific efficiency of people who understood that invisibility was a professional skill. Mira was the best at it. She had arrived 8 months ago with 2 references, a quiet manner, and a name that matched no pack record in the Northern Territories. The head housekeeper, a practical beta female named Seth, had asked the standard questions and received the standard answers. Orphaned. No pack affiliation. Trained in domestic service in a southern holding that no longer existed. The story was not particularly original, but it was internally consistent, and Seth, who had 67 other things to manage, had accepted it and put Mira on laundry rotation. 8 months later, Mira was still on laundry rotation because she had been careful never to be exceptional at anything. She was 23 years old, and she was tall for a woman, lean in the way that suggests economy rather than deprivation, with dark copper-brown skin and dark hair she kept in 2 flat braids pinned behind her head. Her eyes were a warm, deep brown in ordinary light, and she kept them ordinary with the same steady discipline with which she kept everything else about herself ordinary. She wore the palace servant uniform, a long plain tunic in dark gray over fitted dark trousers, with soft leather work boots, and she moved through the palace halls with the particular rhythm of someone who is doing their job and nothing else. She had not spoken more than 40 words in a single conversation in 8 months. She had not shifted in 4 years. She had not used any ability that a standard Omega wolf should not possess. She could run slightly faster than her frame suggested she should. She could sense things before they happened by margins small enough to attribute to instinct. She could tell you what was wrong with a wound before a healer opened it. She kept all of these things in the range of plausible. The Palace of Keldrath was the seat of Alpha King Davin, who ruled the Northern Territories and had done so for 12 years with the mix of effectiveness and brutality that the Northern Territories seemed to consistently produce in their rulers. He was a large male in his late 30s, dark-skinned and powerfully built, with close-cropped hair that was beginning to silver at the temples and eyes that were a very dark brown with an amber ring that only showed fully when he was using his alpha command. He was not a cruel ruler. He was not a kind one. He was an efficient one, which in the north was considered the highest compliment. He had 1 child, a son named Kale. Kale was 7 years old, and he was nothing like his father, which was both his most dangerous quality and his most important one. Where the Alpha King was measured and controlled, Kale was curious and impulsive. Where his father studied situations before engaging, Kale engaged and then discovered the situation on the way. He had dark skin like his father, large dark eyes, close-cropped hair he hated having cut, and a tendency to end up somewhere he had been explicitly told not to go. Mira had noticed him on her third day in the palace. Not because his rank required her to notice him. Because he had stopped in the corridor outside the laundry room and looked at her through the half-open door with his head tilted and said, with the directness only children manage without it being rude, "You smell different from the other servants." She had said, "I use different soap." He had considered this and then accepted it and moved on. She had watched him go and felt the first small thread of something complicated pull loose inside her chest. Children were dangerous in a specific way. They had not yet learned to dismiss their instincts in favor of social acceptability. Kale's instincts were sharp. She had been more careful after that. She changed her soap. The palace had a complicated politics that she had mapped carefully in 8 months of being invisible. The Alpha King's court was divided between his military council, his noble families, and the representatives of the 6 subordinate packs that owed him fealty. Among these there was a faction she had been watching since her second week in the palace. They called themselves the Stone Circle informally. 3 noble families and 1 military commander. They were not subtle enough to be as dangerous as they thought they were, but they were dangerous enough. Their goal, as best Mira had assembled it through 8 months of listening from behind laundry carts and linen closets, was to remove the Alpha King and install a regency that they controlled. The child heir was the complication they had not solved yet. She had been watching and waiting for them to make a move. She had not told anyone what she knew. She had not told anyone because telling anyone would require explaining how she knew it, and explaining how she knew it would require explaining what she was, and she was not ready for that conversation. She was not sure she would ever be ready for that conversation. On the morning of the day everything changed, she had been carrying a basket of pressed linens through the east corridor when she heard Kale's tutor mention to a guard that the young prince had slipped away again during the morning lesson. The tutor was annoyed. The guard was mildly alarmed. Neither of them had escalated it because Kale did this regularly and was always found within the hour. Mira set her basket down. She did not run. Running in the palace corridors was noticed. She walked to the eastern servants' entrance with the same rhythm she always walked, signed out with the gate guard with a note saying she was collecting winter herbs from the kitchen garden, and then she was outside. The moment she was past the palace wall she ran. Not because she had heard anything that suggested Kale was in danger. She ran because something that was not her ears and not her nose had contracted sharply in the center of her chest the moment the tutor said those words, a cold, specific tightening that she had learned over years to trust absolutely. The Ashwood was a managed forest that bordered the palace grounds on the eastern side. It was technically within the palace boundary and was used for controlled hunts and the gathering of materials. It was not large. It was not supposed to be dangerous. The scent of rogues hit her the moment she crossed the tree line. 3 of them. Close. Moving with purpose. And underneath the rogue scent, faint and frightened and very small, Kale. She did not stop to think. She followed the scent at a dead run and found him in a clearing 200 yards into the wood. He was on the ground. He had fallen and one ankle was at a wrong angle. The 3 rogue wolves were circling him in wolf form, large and unhurried, the kind of circling that happens before a thing is decided rather than while it is still in question. He was not screaming. He was very still and very white under his dark skin, staring up at them with the same directness he had used on her in the laundry corridor, as if he was trying to understand the situation rather than escape it. She stepped into the clearing. The largest rogue turned to her. It was the size of a large pony, gray-brown with old scarring across its muzzle and one ear missing. It looked at her and what it saw was a thin human-presenting female in servant gray, and it dismissed her as a threat in approximately 1 second. That was its last significant decision. She did not shift. She did not need to shift. What she did was something that lived in the space between human and wolf, in the layer of power that her particular bloodline carried even in human form. She moved. The rogue lunged. She redirected its weight with a precision that looked impossible for someone her size and drove it into the ground with a force that came from something other than muscle. She did not stop moving. The second wolf had already committed to its attack by the time the first hit the ground. She turned into the second wolf's momentum and broke its charge with a single contact at the base of its skull, the precise point where a wolf's neck structure is vulnerable, and it dropped. The third rogue stopped. Wolves read threat in 1,000 ways beyond size. They read it in scent and in posture and in the specific set of another animal's eyes. What this third wolf was reading in the woman standing in the snow between itself and the child was not a servant. It was not even a wolf, not in any category the third rogue had a name for. It ran. She let it. She turned to the first wolf. It was still alive. She ended that with the efficiency of someone who regretted the necessity and did not look away while doing it. The second wolf was not alive. She checked the third had truly gone, and then she turned to Kale. He was staring at her. Her eyes had gone gold. She knew this without seeing them. She could feel it, the warmth of it, the color that came up from whatever she was when she used this much of herself in human form. He said, "What are you?" She looked at him. 7 years old, ankle broken, 2 dead wolves in the snow beside him, staring at her without crying. She said, "I am someone who is going to get you back inside and have that ankle looked at." He said, "You did not answer my question." She said, "No, I did not." She picked him up carefully, supporting the broken ankle, and began walking back toward the palace. He said nothing more for the first 100 yards. Then he said, "You smell like you did before. Not like soap. Like something old." She kept walking. He said, "I am not going to tell them about you if you do not want me to." She looked at him. He was completely serious. 7 years old and completely serious. She said, "Thank you." He said, "But you have to tell me what you are. That is the deal." She almost smiled. They reached the palace wall. The alarm had been raised in her absence, which she had known it would be. A dozen royal guards were pouring out of the eastern gate when she walked through with the prince in her arms. The head of the royal guard, a massive alpha male named Gareth, came to a dead stop when he saw them. He saw the boy. He saw the blood on her clothing, which was not hers. He saw her eyes, which had not gone entirely back to brown yet. His own eyes went very wide. He said, "Where did you find him?" She said, "The Ashwood clearing, 200 yards in, Eastern Path. There are 2 dead rogues there. You will want to identify them and find out who sent them." She put the prince into Gareth's arms. She said, "His ankle is broken. The left one." She stepped back. Gareth was still staring at her eyes. She said, "I should return to my duties." He said, "You should come with me to the Alpha King." Behind him, 12 guards were watching. Behind them, palace staff had gathered at the gate. Every single one of them was looking at her. 8 months of being invisible ended. She said, "Yes, I suppose I should." Chapter 2. What the Alpha King asks. The Alpha King's receiving hall was designed to communicate power through architecture. High ceilings of dark stone, banners in the black and silver of the Keldrath throne hanging from iron rings, a raised dais at the far end where the throne sat. The room was built for crowds and ceremonies and the deliberate management of impressions. Davin received her in his private study. This was either a concession or a strategy, and she was not sure which. The study was a long room with a fireplace on one wall and shelves of maps and ledgers on the other 3. A heavy desk in the center. 2 chairs across from it. No guards inside the room, though she could hear 2 outside the door and sense 4 more at the corridor ends. He was standing when she entered. He was taller than she had understood from a distance, which was significant because she had been watching him for months, and she was not someone who misjudged distances. He wore the working clothes of a ruler who had been in the middle of governing when his world changed, which was a heavy dark tunic over fitted trousers, a commander's insignia on his left shoulder in dull silver. His dark eyes assessed her with the speed of someone who had been making threat assessments since he was a boy. He said, "Sit." She sat. He remained standing, which was a choice she noted. He said, "My son says you killed 2 rogue wolves with your hands in human form." She said, "Yes." He said, "Gareth says your eyes are gold." She said, "They are brown most of the time." He said, I am aware of that. You have been in my palace for 8 months, and I have looked at your eyes exactly 3 times, and they were brown each time. They are not brown right now. She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were still carrying the gold, fading slowly. She made no attempt to suppress it. He said, What are you? The same words his son had used. She said, My name is Mira. I am 23 years old. I have been in your service for 8 months. Those are true things. He said, They are also insufficient things. She said, I know. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. This surprised her. She had expected him to remain standing for the duration. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at her and said, You have information about the faction that sent those rogues. She had not expected that to be his second question. She said, What makes you say that? He said, Because you told Gareth to identify the wolves and find who sent them. That is not something a servant who happened to be in the right place says. That is something someone says who already knows there is a sender worth finding. She looked at him. He said, I have been running this kingdom for 12 years. I know what conspiracy smells like, and I know what someone who has been watching a conspiracy smells like. You have been watching one. For how long? She said, 8 months. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, Since you arrived. She said, Yes. He said, You came here to watch them. She said, I came here because I received information that your son was in danger and the source of that danger was inside your court. I needed to understand the shape of it before I could act. He said, And what is the shape of it? She said, 3 noble families and 1 military commander. Lord Sen, Lord Castav, Lady Orne, and Commander Herrick. They have been working toward a regency for approximately 2 years. Today was their first direct move against Kale. The silence in the room became very precise. He said, Herrick. She said, Yes. Commander Herrick was his second in military command, a male he had known for 18 years, who had stood at his right hand at his coronation and at the birth of his son, and at every significant moment of his reign. Davin was quiet for a long time. She did not fill the silence. She waited. He said, How do you know this? She said, I am very good at being invisible. I have heard things I should not have been able to hear. He said, Because you are not a servant. She said, I was a servant for 8 months. The work was real. He said, That is not what I asked. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not afraid of her. She had met very few people who were not afraid of her once they understood that something was different about her, and almost none of them were alpha males who had the kind of natural dominance that came from genuine rank and genuine experience. His lack of fear was not performance. It was simply that he was too occupied with processing real information to waste energy on reflexive reaction. She said, What I am is a long answer. What matters right now is the 4 names I just gave you. He said, They both matter. She said, Yes. But the 4 names are more urgent. He considered this. Then he said, What is your read on their timeline? She said, Today was an opportunistic move, not their primary plan. Kale wandered into the Ashwood, and they used the rogues they already had positioned. Their primary plan is larger and requires the Winter Summit when all 6 subordinate pack leaders are in the palace. That is 22 days away. He said, What is the primary plan? She said, I do not have all of it yet. I know it involves Herrick's military access and one of the subordinate pack leaders who has been promised something significant in exchange for cooperation. I believe it is Lord Aldrich of the Icefeld Pack. He stood up and walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to her for a moment. She waited. He turned around and said, I need what you know. All of it. And I need to know what you are because I cannot make a decision about how to use you or how much to trust you without knowing what I am working with. She said, That is a fair position. He said, So. She said, My name is Mira of the Greystone line. I am the last living member of it. The Greystone line is what your scholars would call an extinct bloodline if anyone had bothered to look for us, which they have not because we have been careful not to be found for 3 generations. He said, I have heard the name Greystone once, in an old military text. She said, What did the text say? He said, It said the Greystone Omegas were soldiers of a different kind. That they could not be commanded and could not be tracked, and that going to war with one was like going to war with weather. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother wrote that. She wrote it about herself." She had a sense of humor. He looked at her very carefully. He said, "What can you do?" She said, "In human form, more than you have seen today. In wolf form, considerably more than that." He said, "You have not shifted in this palace." She said, "I have not shifted anywhere in 4 years. The last time I shifted was when I was trying not to, and the situation was bad enough that the choice was taken away from me." He said, "Why are you not shifting?" She said, "Because what comes out when I shift is not something you manage in an enclosed space with 300 people nearby and no warning." The fire popped. The study was very quiet. He said, "When the scholars say the Greystone line is like going to war with weather, are they describing the human form or the wolf?" She said, "The wolf." He nodded slowly. He was working through something. She could see it behind his eyes, a mind that was precise and honest in its processing. He was not trying to find an angle. He was trying to find the truth of the situation and what the truth required. He said, "The Winter Summit is 22 days away. I have a conspiracy inside my court that I cannot move against publicly without the evidence that would destabilize every subordinate pack relationship I have. I need more information, and I need someone who can get it." She said, "I know." He said, "Will you help me?" She looked at him. She had not been asked for help very often. She had been used. She had been hunted. She had been avoided and feared and occasionally worshipped in a way that felt very similar to being feared. She had been given orders by people who thought they had authority over her, and she had listened or not based on her own judgment. She had not often been asked. She said, "I came to this palace for your son. I will stay for your son. The conspiracy is the mechanism. Tell me what you need." He said, "I need you to stop being invisible." She said, "That is the one thing I was hoping you would not ask for." He said, "I know. I am asking anyway." She exhaled slowly. She said, "All right." Chapter 3. The Wolf They Could Not Read. She was given quarters in the palace's secondary residential wing, which was where honored guests stayed when the primary wing was occupied by visiting dignitaries. The room was large by any standard she was used to, and she moved through it that first evening with the careful attention of someone cataloging exits rather than appreciating furnishings. There were 2 windows. One faced east toward the Ashwood. One faced north toward the outer wall. She left both slightly open. A palace attendant arrived with clothing. Not servant Gray. The Alpha King had sent word to the household keeper, and what arrived was a selection of garments from the palace's formal wardrobe, used for guests of varying ranks and kept in a variety of sizes. She chose a long tunic of dark green wool over fitted black trousers and knee-high black boots, all of it plainly cut and well-made, the clothing of someone with function rather than display as their priority. She kept her hair in the 2 flat braids. The court noticed her the next morning. She had expected this. Stopping being invisible after 8 months of practiced invisibility in an enclosed social system was going to be a specific kind of shock. The Court of Keldrath was a system that depended on the careful management of status and role, and she had been categorized as a laundry servant for 8 months. And now she was walking through the same corridors in different clothing, and the Alpha King's guards were acknowledging her, and the household staff were not quite meeting her eyes. She walked through all of it with the same unhurried rhythm she had used to carry laundry baskets. Cale found her before breakfast. He was on a crutch, his left ankle in a structured brace, and he hopped down the corridor toward her with the focused energy of a child who had decided something important and was executing on it. His face was set with the seriousness that she had noted was his default expression when something mattered to him. He said, "You look different." She said, "The clothing is different." He said, "It is not just the clothing. You are walking the same, but people can see you now." She looked at him. He said, "You owe me an answer." "We made a deal," she said. "I recall the deal was that you would not tell them about me in exchange for me telling you what I am." He said, "Yes. And then you told my father yourself, which means you did not need my silence after all. But I still want to know. She said, that is a fair point. She crouched down to be at his eye level. She looked at him directly and she said, I am an Omega from a very old bloodline. Most Omegas are at the bottom of the rank structure. In my bloodline, the rank worked differently. We were still Omegas. We just happened to be Omegas who could do things that Alphas cannot do. He said, like killing 2 rogue wolves with your hands. She said, among other things. He said, can you shift? She said, yes. He said, what does your wolf look like? She said, I have not looked at her in 4 years, so I am working from memory. She is large. Her fur is the color of deep gray with silver running through it like the way frost runs through stone. Her eyes in wolf form are gold. The same gold you saw yesterday. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, why do you not shift? She said, because when I shift it is difficult to be inconspicuous. He said, you are not inconspicuous anymore. She looked at him and said, no, I am not. She stood up. He said, I want to be there when you shift. That is part of the deal too. She said, that was not part of the original deal. He said, I am renegotiating. She almost smiled again. She was doing that more in 2 days than she had done in 4 years. She said, I will think about it. The court's opinion of her crystallized quickly and in 2 opposing directions. The faction she was not worried about, the working staff, the military personnel below command rank, and most of the palace household, accepted her with the pragmatic efficiency of people who understood that she had saved the prince's life and was now a different kind of presence in their world, and they adjusted. The faction she was watching adjusted very differently. Lord Sen was the first to approach her. He was a male of 50, silver-haired and soft in the way that conceals a hard interior, wearing the deep blue and gold of the Sen family. He found her in the Eastern Gallery that afternoon and engaged her in the specific kind of conversation that is not actually conversation but is reconnaissance. He said all the correct things. He praised her bravery. He expressed gratitude for the prince's safe return. He asked gentle questions about her background, her family, her previous service. He was practiced at this kind of conversation, smooth and almost imperceptible in his information gathering. She gave him nothing. Not obviously. She gave him answers. She gave him the same answers she had given Sud 8 months ago, the orphan, the southern holding, the domestic training. She gave them in the tone of someone who had nothing to protect and was happy to share because there was nothing interesting to share. She watched his eyes while she talked and she tracked exactly what he retained and what he dismissed. He retained the gold eyes. He retained the rogue wolves killed in human form. He dismissed everything else. He said, at the end, the Alpha King is fortunate to have someone of your particular gifts available. She said, I am glad I was able to help. He smiled and left. She watched him go and noted that he had walked directly to the Eastern Corridor, which was where Commander Heir kept his secondary office. She gave them 4 hours. Then she went to the evening meal in the Great Hall, which she had never attended as a servant and now attended as something the court was not sure how to categorize. The Great Hall seated 200 when full. At the long table nearest the dais, the noble families and senior court members had their established places. She was seated, by the Alpha King's directive, 3 places to his right, which put her between a general she did not yet have a clear read on and an empty chair that turned out to belong to Commander Heir, who arrived late and sat beside her with the controlled ease of a man who was performing composure. She ate. She listened. She said nothing she had not planned to say. Heir said, toward the end of the meal, the Alpha King speaks highly of you. She said, he is generous. Heir said, a woman of your ability, without a pack affiliation. That is unusual. She said, I imagine it is. He said, have you considered formalizing a position here? A permanent one. The palace can always use someone with your particular skills. She said, I have not had time to think that far ahead. He said, when you do, I would be happy to speak with the Alpha King on your behalf. I have considerable influence in matters of court appointment. She looked at him. He held her gaze with the practiced steadiness of a man who had been looking at people he intended to use and making it seem like warmth for a very long time. She said, "That is very kind. I will keep it in mind." She turned back to her plate. He had just offered to advocate for her position to the king, which meant he either wanted her controlled and inside his structure, or he wanted to assess how much she knew and whether she could be managed. Possibly both. She spent the next 12 days doing things she had not done in 4 years. She was visible. She attended court functions. She sparred with the palace guard at Davin's invitation, carefully, showing more than she had shown as a servant, but still a calibrated portion of what she carried. The guard she sparred with was a senior alpha male who outweighed her by 60 pounds, and who she pinned in 40 seconds the first time and in 23 seconds the second time when he came in more cautiously. The court watched this and became very quiet in a new way. She reported to Davin every evening in the private study. She told him what she had heard, who had spoken to whom, how the 4 members of the faction were responding to her presence. She told him that Heir was frightened underneath the performance. She told him that Lady Orn was the most dangerous of the 4 because she was the most patient and the most willing to change the plan rather than commit to it rigidly. He listened to all of it and asked precise questions. On the 9th day he said, "Kale wants you to teach him something." She said, "He mentioned it to me as well." He said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him I would think about it." He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, that a 7-year-old boy who follows his instincts into danger needs to learn what his instincts are telling him and how to respond to them usefully, and that a formal combat trainer is not going to teach him that. He said, "And you will." She said, "If you permit it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I permit it." He paused. He said, "You did not have to ask my permission." She said, "No. But it is his father I am asking. That is a different kind of permission." He looked at her in that way he had, the precise focused assessment, and then something in his face did a thing she had not seen it do before. It relaxed slightly around the eyes. He said, "Yes. Teach him." On the 11th day the faction moved. Not toward the prince this time. Toward her. 3 men came to her room at the 2nd hour past midnight. They were not rogues this time. They were palace guards wearing unmarked dark clothing, which meant Heir had used his military access to activate personnel he had specifically recruited for this purpose. They were trained. They were silent. They had silver-tipped weapons and ashroot compound on their blades. She was not asleep. She had not been asleep because she had known, from the way Heir had looked at her during the last 3 evening meals, that the timeline was compressing. He was afraid she was too close to the king. He was afraid she knew too much. He was right on both counts. The 3 men came through the window she had left open. She was standing in the center of the room. In human form, she handled 2 of them in the time it took the 3rd to register that the other 2 were down. The 3rd had the sense to throw his silver blade rather than close with her. She caught it by the handle, which was not silver, and looked at him. He ran. She let him run. She needed him to run back to Heir. She needed Heir to know that 3 trained men had not been sufficient. She needed him to decide that the only answer was to use the winter summit as planned, ahead of schedule, by whatever means he had at hand. She needed him to move before he was ready so that she could see the full shape of the plan before it was executed. She sat on the edge of her bed with the blade across her knees and waited for morning. Comment right now. Did you expect that? Subscribe and share this story. Like the video and tell us in the comments what you think Heir does next. Chapter 4. The Fight That Cannot Be Survived. She told Davin about the 3 men in the morning. She told him in the private study with the door closed, and she laid the silver blade on his desk and told him where the 2 who were not walking came from, which she knew from the insignia on their boots that they had not removed. His face did not change while she told him. That was a skill, that particular quality of stillness. She had seen it before, in people who had learned that they could not afford to let what they felt show in their face, because others were watching all the time. He said, "You are not injured." She said, "No." He said, "Why did you let the 3rd one go?" She said, I need Heir panicking. A panicking man uses the plan he has rather than building a better one. He said, and the plan he has. She said, the Winter Summit. 11 days from now. I believe he will move it forward. I believe he will try to use the summit dinner, which is the one occasion where the subordinate pack leaders are together in an enclosed space with the Alpha King without full guard protocol, because it is a diplomatic occasion and weapons are traditionally left outside. He said, you believe Lord Aldrich of Icefeld is inside this. She said, I believe Aldrich's second in command is inside this without Aldrich's knowledge. Lord Aldrich has been promised something. His second has been promised something different. The plan requires both of them, but only one of them knows the full shape of it. He said, my son. She said, they will make a move against Kale at the summit. Not to kill him this time. To take him. A living heir in someone else's possession is worth more than a dead one. He said, can you stop it? She was quiet for a moment. She said, I can stop what happens to Kale. Stopping the summit assassination attempt requires me to be in 2 places at once. He said, then I handle the summit and you protect Kale. She said, you will be in the room when they move against you. Your guard will not be at full protocol. They will have numbers and surprise and access. He said, I have been fighting politically and physically since I was 17. I can handle a room. She looked at him. He said, you do not think I can. She said, I think you can handle most things in a room. I think this particular configuration of enemies in this particular room with this particular element of surprise is going to be worse than you are planning for. He said, what do you suggest? She said, I need to be at the summit. I need someone else to handle Kale. He said, there is no one else I trust with Kale at this level. She said, I know. That is the problem. They sat with the problem for a moment. He said, can you teach him in 11 days what he needs to know to stay safe? She said, I can teach him in 11 days what he needs to know to hide. Staying safe requires him to be where they are not looking. Kale's instincts are good. If he knows to trust them and act on them specifically rather than generally, he can move to safety without knowing the full picture. He said, he is 7 years old. She said, I know. He is also the child who sat with 2 dead wolves in the snow and did not panic. He has better instincts than most adults I have worked with. Davin was quiet. Then he said, do it. 11 days. She began training Kale that afternoon. She taught him, first, how to read the air. Not in the poetic sense, but in the literal one, how to stop and smell and separate what he was smelling into components: fear, aggression, intention. His wolf senses were not yet fully developed at 7, but they were present, and she showed him how to use what he had. He was an extraordinary student. Not because he was obedient, he was very much not obedient. He questioned everything and argued positions and needed to understand why before he would do how. But he learned fast when he understood, and his instincts were everything she had told his father they were. On the 3rd day of training he said, you are going to shift soon. She said, what makes you say that? He said, you smell like you are getting ready. It is the same feeling as before a storm. The air changes before the storm comes. You are changing. She looked at him. He was right. She could feel it, the bloodline pressure that had been building since she stopped pretending. Not a warning. An arrival. She said, yes. I think I am. He said, you said I could be there. She said, I said I would think about it. He said, you have thought about it. She had. She said, yes. You can be there. On the 5th day of training, the summit moved. Heir had done exactly what she had needed him to do. He had told Lord Aldrich that security concerns required moving the summit dinner to the following day, which was 6 days away instead of 11. He had used his military authority and Aldrich's second to coordinate the change without going through standard palace protocol. Davin told her in the evening meeting and said, we have 6 days. She said, I know. I heard the change being made this afternoon. He looked at her. She said, your eastern corridor has a sound property at the junction near the archivist's room where sounds from the commander's office carry around the corner. I found it in my first week. He said, of course you did. She said, I will shift tomorrow night. I need to know what I am carrying before the summit. I need to know how much of it is available. He said, where? She said, the Eastern Training Ground. After midnight. He said, I will be there. She said, Kale asked to be there. He looked at her. He said, he asked you or he asked me. She said, both of us on the same afternoon, separately. He is thorough. Davin did a thing that she realized, after a moment, was a smile. It was brief and amused-looking, like a door in a room that does not get opened very often. He said, yes. He can come. The Eastern Training Ground was a wide flat space of packed earth enclosed by a stone wall, used for full-contact training and shift exercises in all weather. At midnight it was empty and dark except for the torches at the wall corners. Davin was there when she arrived. Kale was beside him, ankle brace still on, leaning on his crutch, wide awake and vibrating with the specific energy of a child staying up past midnight for something important. Gareth was there with 4 guards at the wall, which she had expected. She walked to the center of the training ground. She stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. For years of held breath. She let it go. The shift of a Greystone Omega is not like ordinary wolf transformation in the way a river is not like a puddle. Both are water. They are not the same thing. The change that moved through her was total and immediate, and it was not violent. It was the opposite of violent. It was the release of a pressure that had been building for 4 years, her body finally doing what it had been made to do. The wolf she became was large. Not grotesquely so, not the draft horse scale of the oldest power wolves. But large the way a storm is large, present in every dimension, filling the space it occupied completely. Her fur was exactly as she had described to Kale, deep gray with silver threading through it in fine lines like frost patterns in stone. Her eyes in wolf form burned gold, the same gold that came up in her human eyes when she used too much of herself. She stood in the center of the training ground and breathed. The 4 guards at the wall had taken a collective step back. Gareth's hand had gone to his sword before he caught himself. Davin had not moved. He stood with his arms at his sides, and he looked at her in wolf form with the same precise assessment he used on everything, and she could see him filing away what he was seeing, adding it to his model of the situation. Kale said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, "She is beautiful." She turned her gold eyes on him. He grinned. She shifted back. The return was as quiet as the going. She stood in human form in the center of the ground, and her eyes were still gold, and she was breathing slowly. She felt more like herself than she had in 4 years. Davin said, quietly, "What can you do in that form that you cannot do in human form?" She said, "In wolf form I can track any individual by scent across any terrain and in any weather for as long as needed. I can sense the location of every wolf within a quarter mile. I can suppress the shift of other wolves within my immediate presence for short periods. I can sustain significantly more physical force than in human form. My healing in wolf form is immediate for most injuries." He said, "Can you be killed?" She said, "Yes. Harder than most things. Not impossible." He said, "The summit is in 5 days." She said, "I know." He said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "Access to the summit room before it begins. The seating chart. And your trust." He said, "You have the first 2. She said, "And the 3rd. He said, "And the 3rd. She nodded. Kale said from beside his father, "When the summit is over, can we do this again?" Neither of the adults answered for a moment. Then Mira said, "Yes." Chapter 5. The Summit and What Comes After. The Winter Summit dinner was held in the Great Ceremonial Hall, the largest space in the Palace of Keldrath, which seated 300 at its full extension. For the summit it was set for 42, the Alpha King and his senior court at the central table, the 6 subordinate pack leaders and their seconds at the surrounding tables. The whole arrangement designed to communicate that all present were important enough for intimacy, but not so important as to sit at the king's table. Mira arrived 2 hours before the first guest. She walked the room alone. She examined every table, every chair, Every window and door and the distance between the kitchen entrance and the main doors and the service corridor that ran along the north wall behind a decorative stone screen. She noted the torch placement, the sight lines, the acoustics. She noted where Heirek's seat was and where Lord Aldrich II would be sitting and where the 2 guards at the door would stand. She noted the 4 places in the room where someone could position themselves and remain unobserved from the main table. She chose the service corridor behind the stone screen. She was wearing dark clothing, fitted and practical, with her hair in the 2 flat braids and soft boots that made no sound on stone. She had nothing that a standard court observer would call a weapon. Her hands were her weapons. The abilities she carried were her weapons. For years of chosen restraint and 5 days of remembering what she was had brought her to a clarity she had not felt in a long time. She was ready. Chaol was in his rooms on the far side of the palace with 2 guards she trusted and a 3rd layer of protection she had arranged with Davin and that Chaol himself did not fully know about, which was that she had spent 2 of their training sessions teaching him exactly what to do if someone came for him and how to get to the specific room in the eastern residential wing where she had stockpiled water, food, and the means to bar a door from the inside. He had listened to those sessions with a seriousness that had made her chest tighten in the specific way that is not sadness and not pride, and is something for which there is no clean word. The guests arrived between the 6th and 7th hour of evening. She watched from behind the screen and catalogued. Lord Sen arrived with his 2nd and both of them were carrying slightly too much tension in their shoulders for a diplomatic occasion. Lady Orne arrived late, which was unusual for her, and her eyes moved too quickly across the room when she entered. Lord Castav had not arrived at all, which meant he was elsewhere in the palace, which meant his role was different from the others. She filed Castav's absence. She would return to it. Commander Heir arrived last, which was his right as the senior military officer present. He was in full formal uniform, black and silver, every inch the trusted commander. He sat beside the Alpha King's right hand. Davin arrived. He was in formal wear, the deep black and silver of the Keldrath throne house, a heavy formal tunic over black trousers, his commander's insignia at his shoulder now in polished silver. He moved through the room with the unhurried authority of a man entirely at home in his own power, greeting each subordinate pack leader by name, pausing for the appropriate exchanges. He did not look toward the screen. She appreciated that. The first course was served. Conversation moved in the measured political rhythms of these occasions, each pack leader performing their loyalty and their interests simultaneously in the careful balance that had kept the Northern Territories functional for 12 years. She was watching Heir. He was watching Aldrich II, a male named Brenz who was seated 3 tables away. Brenz was eating with concentrated attention, which meant he was not eating, he was waiting. His hands were not shaking, but they were not fully relaxed either. The signal came between the 2nd and 3rd course. It was a sound from the eastern corridor. A specific sound, 2 knocks followed by 1 on the Great Hall's eastern servant door. It was subtle enough that no one at the tables would have registered it as significant. She registered it. She also registered what it meant. Castav was in position and Chaol was the target he was moving toward right now. She had prepared for this. She had told Davin 3 days ago that Castav would be the one sent for the boy while the others handled the summit. She had told him what Chaol needed to do, and she had made sure Chaol understood it without frightening him, framed as a game of moving quickly and quietly to a specific room. She stayed where she was. She trusted Chaol. Heir moved at the 3rd course. It was elegant. She would grant him that. He rose to offer a toast, which was traditional and expected, and while every eye in the room was on him and every glass was raised, Brenz rose from his table and moved to the service door near the kitchen and admitted 4 men who should not have been in the palace at all. They were not in formal dress. They were in the dark, practical clothing of people who were there to do something and leave quickly. 2 of them moved toward Davin. 2 positioned at the main doors. The room understood very quickly what was happening. Pack leaders began rising from their seats. Heirek's toast had dissolved into something else entirely, and he was now standing with his hand on a blade that he had brought into a room where weapons were not supposed to exist. The two guards at the main door, who had been Heir's men all along, were blocking the exit. She came through the stone screen. She did not shift yet because the room was enclosed and full of people she was not trying to harm, and a full wolf in this space would create its own chaos. She moved in human form, and she hit the first of the two men advancing on Davin before he had closed half the distance. Redirecting his path with the precise force she had spent 8 months pretending not to possess, and driving him into the second man so that both went down. Heir saw her. He pulled his blade and came at her, and she felt, in the moment before he reached her, the thing she had been feeling building for days finally arrive fully. She had been holding the shift back from the moment she had let it loose in the training ground. She had been saying not yet, not in this enclosed space, not with all these people around. The blade in Heir's hand was silver. She felt it even at range, the particular cold of silver against the blood of her line, and she understood that he had been briefed on what she might be and had prepared accordingly. She had seconds to decide. She shifted. In the great hall of Keldrath Palace, with 42 people present, the Greystone Omega shifted. The effect on the room was immediate and total. Every wolf in the space felt it in their blood first, before their eyes registered what was happening, the ancient recognition of something that was above and prior to every rank system they had ever understood. Pack leaders who had been rising to fight sat back down involuntarily. The two men at the door stood very still. Friends who had been moving toward the service exit stopped moving. Only Heir kept moving. He was too committed, too far down the road of what he had decided, and he drove the silver blade forward at the gray wolf standing between him and the Alpha King. The silver touched her and it burned. She felt it, the specific burn of silver against Greystone blood, which was not the same as ordinary silver against ordinary wolf. It caused pain. It did not stop her. She took the blade in her shoulder. She took it because taking it put her past his reach and her weight behind his center of balance, and she drove him to the ground with a force that shook the table nearest them and did not get up until she heard his sword arm break under the impact. He went still. The room was completely silent. She stood over him in wolf form, the blade still in her shoulder, gold eyes sweeping the room. The two men at the door had lowered their weapons. Brens was on his knees. Lord Sen and Lady Orn were very still in their chairs. Davin was standing beside her. He said, quietly, to the room at large, "I will ask everyone to remain where you are. My guard will be here shortly." He said, more quietly, to her, "Can you shift back?" She shifted back. In human form, the silver blade was still in her shoulder. She reached back and pulled it out, which required a controlled patience that she managed, and held it in her hand and breathed slowly while the wound began to seal. It took longer than a normal wound would. Silver always did. Davin's eyes were on her shoulder. She said, "I am all right." He said, "You took a silver blade." She said, "It was the available option." "How are you?" He said, "Uninjured. Because of you." The guards arrived. The room became the organized chaos of a serious situation being managed by people who knew their jobs. Heir was removed. Sen and Orn and Brens were detained. The 4 men who had come through the kitchen door were collected. A runner came from the eastern residential wing with a message that she felt before she read it. Kale had made it to the room. He was safe. Lord Castav had found a barred door and a 7-year-old boy on the other side of it who had followed his instructions precisely. She sat down on the edge of the nearest table. She was not someone who sat down in the middle of an active situation. She sat down because her shoulder hurt and the adrenaline was leaving, and she was suddenly aware that she had not slept more than 4 hours in 3 days. Davin sat beside her. Not across from her. Beside her. He said, "The subordinate pack leaders are going to have questions." She said, "I know." He said, "They saw what you are." She said, "Yes." He said, "What do you want me to tell them?" She thought about this. She had spent 4 years constructing answers to versions of this question, and all of those answers had involved concealment in one form or another. She said, "Tell them the truth. Tell them what I am. Tell them I was here because the prince needed protection and I provided it. Tell them anything else they want to know. I am done with the version of this where I am smaller than I am to make the room more comfortable. He said, that will cause considerable conversation. She said, I expect so. He said, some of them will be afraid. She said, that is their right. Fear is honest. I would rather have honest fear than comfortable pretense. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what do you want? After this, when the room is settled and the arrests are processed and Kale is safe and all the immediate things are handled. What do you want? It was not a question she had been asked before. Not like this. Not in this plain and genuine way. She said, I want to finish teaching Kale. He is halfway through understanding something important, and I would like to see him get there. He said, and after that. She said, I want to be something other than a secret. He said, you will never be invisible again after tonight. She said, I know. That is what I want. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, the position I am thinking of offering you does not have a title yet. It would need to be created. She said, what kind of position? He said, the kind where you are not a servant, and you are not a guest, and you are not a weapon. The kind where you are here because you choose to be, and you have authority commensurate with what you carry, and you answer to yourself and to me in the way that any two people who are building something together answer to each other. She said, that is not a position. That is a partnership. He said, yes. She was quiet for a long time. The room around them was still being managed and organized, and the formal machinery of consequence was beginning its slow work. The fire in the great hall hearth was burning. The winter outside pressed against the high windows. She said, I would like that. He said, good. Kale arrived at the 9th hour, escorted by 3 guards and moving on his crutch with the focused determination of someone who had received a message that the danger had passed and had immediately decided to be where the action was. He came through the great hall doors and found his father and Mira sitting side by side on the edge of a table in the middle of an organized aftermath, and he assessed the situation with the directness that was his defining feature, and he said, did it work? She said, yes. He said, did you shift? She said, yes. He said, I missed it. She said, you did what I asked you to do instead. That was more important. He thought about this and accepted it with the grace of a child who has genuinely understood a lesson rather than simply being told to accept one. He said, you promised me again. She said, I remember. He said, soon. She said, soon. He looked at his father and then back at her. He said, you are staying. It was not a question. He said it the same way he had said everything since the beginning, as a thing he had already understood from the available evidence, stated plainly so that the understanding could be confirmed or corrected. She said, yes. He said, good. You smell like you belong here. Davin looked at his son and then at Mira. She said, quietly so only Davin could hear, the first day I met him he said I smelled different. He was right then too. Davin said, what do you smell like? She said, my grandmother said I smell like deep forest and old stone and something that has been waiting a long time to move. He said, she was not wrong. Outside the winter was long and the north was cold, and the politics of 6 subordinate pacts and a dismantled conspiracy and an ancient bloodline returning to visibility would take years to settle into something stable. Inside the great hall of Keldrath, the Alpha King and the last Greystone Omega sat on the edge of a table together, while the work of what came next was already beginning around them. A 7-year-old boy stood between them. He smelled, to anyone with a sensitive enough nose, like someone who was exactly where he was supposed to be. So did she. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If this story moved you, subscribe right now and turn on the bell. Leave a comment below telling us your favorite moment from this story. Like this video and share it with someone who loves a powerful Omega who refused to stay hidden. We will see you in the next one.